All right, so we're going to go over ecosystem ecology. Learning objectives. At the end of this, you should know what ecosystems are. You should already know that, but how they're being affected by climate change, understand what the greenhouse effect is and what it has to do with global warming, as well as know how carbon cycles through different ecosystems and how scientists compare the present and past atmospheric CO2 levels and what they can learn from those comparisons. So this chapter focuses pretty heavily on maple farms, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but we're going to kind of focus more so on the climate change aspect of it and how we know what's happening, what we're measuring, and what climate versus weather actually is. So climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. Weather is local atmospheric conditions, and it's over a short interval. So this is the key part. Weather is short, climate is long-term, so usually over decades. In this course, we're going to consider climate to be something that you've measured for over 30 years. So climate, you're looking at different temperature and precipitation patterns. So like whether we have cold or wet, or hot, dry, warm, wet, like tropical versus temperate. Weather is like daily temperature. It might even be weekly or monthly. Once it becomes a trend over decades, over 30 years, that's when you consider it climate. But we don't consider this necessarily a wet climate because it's been raining all week, right? We have to look at data for decades to be able to understand what the climate actually looks like. So that's the difference between weather and climate. And we're not just talking about daily weather changes, we're talking about changes in climate over decades, sometimes even over hundreds of thousands of years. Again, just some examples. Daily weather. This is September Bethlehem temperature data, and you can see that it's just looking at it over the whole month. And you can see the average daily temperature, and you can see these little bars that we have here. So you have the average daily temperature is like the actual dot, and then it corresponds with the monthly average temperature. This is what's called a climatograph. So you have precipitation here in the blue, and it's followed with temperature in red. This is climate. The other two were weather. Even a climatograph, I know it sounds a little confusing, but that still is showing you weather. This is climate. So you can see the years down here. We're looking at a span of over 30 years, and that's where we see climate. So you can see it's changing, right? Like it's going up and down, and that's what we consider the weather in that short time period. But overall, you can see that as we go through time, at least in this town in Allentown, Pennsylvania, the general trend is that the temperature is increasing. And again, it's going up and down all over the place, but you can see that it's still increasing, that you're seeing higher temperatures now in later years than you were at the beginning of this record. So what kind of factors influence climate? Climate's regulated by lots of different complex interactions. So the sun, earth, ocean, atmosphere, all of those kind of go into making a climate. And a lot of it has to do with something we call a greenhouse effect, which we'll talk about a little bit more here in a few minutes. But it's just the idea that the energy is absorbed by the sun and it's trapped by these gases in the atmosphere. And because the sun's dominant influence on the planet, we expect the climate to vary both regionally and seasonally depending on how the sun is hitting the earth at that time. When we're talking about climate and weather, we have to consider how it's affecting the overall ecosystem. So we went over ecosystems last class. Ecosystem is just the whole biological community. It includes all of the abiotic or non-living factors, as well as all of the biotic factors or living factors. So it's how those non-living factors, abiotic, interact with different organisms. Again, we have the biotic, the living component. So that's plants, animals, microorganisms, usually fall into either autotrophs, which are our photosynthesizers, or heterotrophs. And again, they can work your way up the food web and see what kind of organisms you're looking at in the ecosystem. And then we also have abiotic, so things like sunlight, temperature, precipitation, topography or terrain, as well as soil. All of these things go into what an ecosystem is, what can live there, what can thrive. So when we're talking about climate change, we'll get into a lot of the specifics of it, but a big thing that we're seeing is that climate change is affecting the habitats in which organisms can live. So a habitat is just the physical environment where an organism lives and to which it's adapted. Climate change can alter those habitats for different organisms. And the example that your book gives is the maple trees, because you can see here in this photo or in this figure that you're looking at the past from 1960 to 1990, and then you're looking at a projected. So this isn't something that we know for sure, but following the trends from before the 60s and to now, we can kind of guess what it's going to look like. And you can see that the different colors are different species of plants, essentially. And you can see that it's changing quite a bit. So before we had maple is all the red stuff up here. Let me get my red pen. All the red up here in the upper northeast. And you can see that it's essentially disappearing in our projected model on the right. And that's because it's getting warmer and warmer, and maple actually requires it to get to a certain temperature. It has to be pretty cold and it has to thaw out during the day, but only up to a certain temperature. And because it's getting warmer, you're seeing less and less of this maple, and overall the maple is creeping up northwards. We used to get maple all the way down here, and now we're finding it mostly in the very upper north of the United States and mostly into Canada. So it is affecting our maple production, and overall, maybe say in 2070 or 2100, which we may or may not be here, some of you might be here, we might not actually get maple production. So that's an idea, or that's an example of how climate change can alter a habitat. It can do that for lots of other plants and animals as well, and that's a problem. So it can push animals up into different habitats, which they then have to compete with other animals that are in those habitats, or they might not be able to adapt quick enough to be able to survive there and thrive. So all animals are kind of adapted to a specific habitat, and it's usually within, well, it's not usually, it is within a certain biome. So biomes are really large geographic areas, and it's defined by its characteristic plant life. So these biomes are determined by climatic factors. So when we talk about biomes, they're usually characterized because of their temperature and their rainfall. So you can see here we've got an example biome, and that's where maple trees are living. They live in a temperate deciduous forest. We'll talk about that in a second. But temperate deciduous forests have 4 seasons, okay? And that's critical to make maple grow, essentially. If we don't have those 4 seasons, it's not really an environment conducive to growing maple trees, as well as other species, but we're focused on maple here. Okay, so here are our biomes. So we have 2 different types of biomes. We have aquatic, let's see if I can write it out here, versus terrestrial. You've probably heard these terms before. Aquatic is probably a little bit more simple, right? Aquatic is water. So we can either have marine, or freshwater. So when we're looking at aquatic biomes, again, all of these biomes are characterized by different climatic factors. When we're looking at aquatic ones, we're really kind of depending on temperature and salinity. So we're looking at how cold or warm the water is, as well as how much salinity it has in the water. So for the most part, freshwater versus marine, there are some kind of gray areas in between there. So those are our only 2 aquatic biomes. The rest of them are terrestrial. And keep in mind, the marine biome is actually the largest biome. It covers 3/4 of the Earth's surface. So pay attention to these biomes. You will probably see them on a test. You might not see them on a quiz, but you will see them on a test. So again, marine, largest biome, covers about 3/4 of the Earth's surface, which you've probably heard that too, that over 70 to 75%, maybe even a little bit more, is ocean, right? And then freshwater, a little bit less, right? Those are basically just low salt concentrations. So our other ones down here, tropical forest, temperate forest, grassland, desert, taiga, and tundra, are all terrestrial. Okay, so terrestrial just means that they're of Earth, essentially. And unlike aquatic, where we're just looking at basically temperature and saline, or salinity. Now we have to look at a few other factors. So we have temperature, rainfall, as well as seasonal variations that all kind of change the vegetation in the area. So we have tropical forest, right? So that's warm temperature, lots of rainfall, right? So that's kind of closer to like where we are, right? We're tropical. And then we also have temperate forests. Again, these are the guys with 4 seasons. So anytime you see something with 4 seasons, we're pretty much talking about a temperate forest. Grassland, that one probably is a little bit easier. Warm temperatures, not enough rainfall to support trees, essentially. So we'll do like little trees. Nope, we don't have them. And when I think of grasslands, I think oftentimes of places in Africa, which might be where you're thinking of too. I'm not sure. We also have deserts. Deserts obviously have extreme dryness. They can be hot or cold though, so keep in mind deserts can still reach freezing temperatures, and some of them reach freezing temperatures in the winter and extremely hot temperatures in the summer, but they're characterized mostly by their very, very dry. Okay, taiga. We're not talking about Taiga the rapper. I don't know, is he a rapper? Seems insulting to call him a rapper, but taiga, anyways, is really long, cold winters and then very short summers. So mostly we have like conifer trees here. So again, long winter. I know my writing's terrible here. Short summer. And then tundra. Okay, hopefully you guys have heard of tundra before, but tundra is like upper north, right? And even to the south actually, but I always think of like Canadian North sort of thing. Very cold, very dry too. So the dry also applies to tundra, but here we're talking about very cold. Again, deserts can also be really cold, but this has permafrost. Okay. So permafrost is essentially underneath the soil, and it's like it sounds, perma meaning permanent frost. So those are our basic biomes. Okay, so when we're talking about different animals or different species, different plants, organisms that can live in different biomes, we're talking about which ones they can live in and why. And with climate change altering their habitats within those biomes, they might actually be pushed into different biomes as well as different habitats. And habitats is basically just a smaller space. It's not the whole biome that we're talking about. Okay. So greenhouse effect. Have we heard of greenhouse effect? I'm sure you have with all the talk of fossil fuels and climate change, but greenhouse effect is a natural process and we actually need it in order to survive. So basically all of our sun's energy enters the Earth's atmosphere and then some of it gets reflected off and leaves the atmosphere pretty quickly, if not right away. And then some of that heat energy is absorbed by our greenhouse gases. So we have a few different greenhouse gases. The one we hear about most is obviously probably carbon dioxide, but there's carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, a few different fluorinated gases. So there's lots of different greenhouse gases. The one that we're most worried about tends to be CO2. And you probably have heard of methane. I know you have in this class at least. And this is probably a bigger problem with livestock production. But CO2 is also a huge problem, especially with burning of fossil fuels. So the idea behind the greenhouse effect is that it essentially keeps our Earth nice and warm. And we need that. If we didn't have these greenhouse gases, then our Earth would actually be, I think it's somewhere like -18, -20 degrees Celsius. So it would be crazy cold. We wouldn't be able to live here, and neither would many of the species that we see on Earth. So we do need these greenhouse gases. The problem is that we have increased production of greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane, and that's being trapped in just like it would normally be, and that's causing our Earth to warm, essentially. So you guys can go over this on your own. This is probably a good figure to study to understand greenhouse effect, but it's what we just went over. And again, the primary greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, they're both naturally and anthropogenically produced. So it means that we reproduce them as humans, but they're also naturally produced. Like fossil fuels are natural, right? We'll talk about them in a second, but the burning of them is not necessarily natural. Okay, so again, natural processes like volcanic eruptions where we get lots of like sulfur dioxide in the air as well, burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, agricultural and industrial practices, livestock production, and lots of other human activities, right? Which a lot of them go back to burning of fossil fuels as well. But all of those things increase the amount of greenhouse gases that we have in the atmosphere. So when we talk about climate change, again, climate is over 30 years. So when we're talking about the change of that climate, it's a significant change that measures climate lasting for an extended period of time. So again, we're talking about over 30 years. In terms of climate change, we're talking about actually a much bigger number than that. But climate change includes major changes in temperature, precipitation, or wind patterns, as well as other effects that you might see. And again, several decades or longer, we'll go with at least 30 years. Most of the time when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about even more than that. So why do we refer to it as climate change and not global warming? Scientists have kind of gotten themselves into trouble with global warming because global warming makes it sound like the Earth is warming and that's all that's happening. It is true the Earth is warming, but other things are happening because of that, right? So you see lots of really dramatic storm events or really maybe dramatic snowfall, and that is happening, and it doesn't mean that global warming isn't happening or that the overall trend isn't increasing. But that's a result of climate change, not global warming. So again, global warming is just recent and ongoing rise in global average temperature near Earth's surface. So again, remember, it just goes up and down all the time, but over time, our general is increasing. And it's mostly because of increased concentration of greenhouse gases. It does cause climate patterns to change, but it's only one aspect of climate change. It's not the whole picture. So when we're talking about climate change, we try to steer away from saying just global warming because a lot of people don't understand that because they don't just see the climate warming, they see lots of other things happening. So we overall usually go with climate change. So part of the reason why we're seeing this climate change is because we're pulling carbon from places we wouldn't normally. So this is all part of the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is natural, and it's just the way that carbon moves between organic and inorganic in the environment. So we know that photosynthesis plays a huge role in this, right? We remove a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere via photosynthesis, and then we also release some into the atmosphere in different things, and we store a lot in organic soil, right? So we store a lot underground, and that's how we get things like coal, natural gas, oil. All of those are locked out of the carbon cycle. But when we drill and we get them up and then we start burning them, we actually put them back into the carbon cycle. So now instead of sitting basically dormant and staying out of our carbon cycle underground, we're pulling them in and then we're increasing the amount of them in the carbon cycle as well as in our atmosphere. So that's really where we get into trouble and why we're seeing such a huge increase in CO2 levels. Also happens from other things, right? Like deforestation, land use, and you get it from livestock production as well, all sorts of things. Okay, again, another figure just showing you the same thing. But the carbon dioxide concentrations that we're seeing are the highest that we've seen in, I think it's actually 800,000 years. So how do we know that? We obviously have not been able to measure CO2 for that long. We've only been measuring CO2, I think, since about the 50s. And for the most part, our CO2 data comes from Mauna Loa on Big Island. But the way we can measure changes in CO2 is we actually collect these ice cores from glaciers. And they have little gas bubbles trapped inside, and we can measure the amount of CO2 in those gas bubbles, and it's basically like looking back in time. So it's kind of like almost like fossil records, but now we're measuring the gas in little air pockets essentially that we find in ice. So because of this, there is a strong belief that humans are changing the climate. Okay. So when we're talking about the carbon cycle, we talk often about carbon footprint. So you guys calculated out your ecological footprint, and that includes your carbon footprint. So ecological footprint, right, is kind of measuring everything, all of the land and resources essentially that you need in order to be able to function or to be able to support your lifestyle. So that's quite a bit, right? And that includes your carbon footprint, which is the measure of greenhouse gases produced by human activities. And in this case, if it's your carbon footprint, it's the amount of greenhouse gases produced just for your activities. So how much fossil fuel you have to burn also includes rice and cattle, deforestation, concrete production, so building of cities. All of those things really increase your carbon footprint. So again, getting into the argument, among scientists, this isn't an argument. You'll never talk to a scientist that doesn't believe that humans are responsible for climate change as well as increased CO2. So for over 800,000 years, we have data looking at CO2 concentrations, and you can see it's gone up and down, and it has really dramatic shifts. But right here, right around the start of the Industrial Revolution, look at how quickly it went up. So one, it's going up higher than it has been in the last 800,000 years. Carbon dioxide levels have been higher before. The Earth has been around for over 800,000 years. At least that's what we predict from different models, and it's probably true. But it's never risen this fast. So this is what really worries scientists, is that in the last 100 years, since we've industrialized everything, we've gone crazy quick to increase this much. So you can see how long it takes to increase in some of these other years, and it's kind of hard to tell on this graph, but the amount that we've increased and the short little time that we've increased in the last 100 years is pretty crazy, and it continues to increase even during this time. So how much time do we have left? There's lots of different studies, right? And they all say different things. Year of climate departure that one study said a couple of years ago is 2029, which is pretty soon. And timing of climate departure globally, again, around 2029, but most places, so between 1 and 5 billion people, which we have about 7 billion people on Earth. So 1 and 5 billion people, which is a pretty big difference in a number, are going to live in areas facing novel climates by 2050. This isn't meant to be totally doom and gloom. There are really good things that are happening in the world, and there's lots of things that we can do, but especially living in an island ecosystem, we have to really be aware of this because we have such a big sea level rise and we have such quick climate change, especially here, that we need to kind of be preparing for the future and doing our best to stop it or slow it as much as possible. So I think this is a few years old. I actually need to update this, but you can see the sea level rise. You can see in this little figure over to the right, it could move. Our shoreline could be about a full mile inland, which is 2 billion lost overall every single year. Every single year we're going to be losing $2 billion. So in addition to losing lots of property and possibly people, species, you're also going to be losing tons of money, right? Where are we looking at right here? We're looking at Waikiki. As much as some of us may not love Waikiki, Waikiki is essentially our economy, right? And we're seeing that even more so now. So that's a huge problem, that the sea level could rise that much. Even a sea level rise in only 1.3 inches, that's up to 3 feet by 2100. It also increases drought in some places, with overall decreased precipitation. Another big problem is ocean acidification. We won't get into the chemical process of ocean acidification, but basically it means that the pH of our oceans is lowering, right? And so these animals that live in that environment have to adapt really quickly to a totally different acidic environment, essentially. And it's happening very quickly, and we're not quite sure that they can adapt the way that they need to in order to survive. We'll skip over that. So climate change and ecosystems. Why is climate change so potentially disastrous for ecosystems and for specific species? A lot of species aren't really going to be negatively affected by climate change. Like, for instance, birds. Birds can move and adapt pretty quickly, right? They can fly 50 miles north and get to a cooler habitat if they need to. They can change biomes, probably. Not all of them, but quite a few. But as one species has success in coping with climate change, it may also contribute to another's demise. So if we have birds that are moving, let's say, further north, they're now going to be competing with other birds that were there previously. And depending on which one, it's survival of the fittest, right? So whatever one is better adapted to that environment is going to survive. So even if that bird is able to survive in a new environment, it might kill off other species that are there as well. Okay, this is especially a deal for things like plants, right? Why are animals better adapted to deal with this essentially than plants? And it's because the animals are more adaptable They're more mobile than plants, so if an animal needs to be able to move for some reason, they can get up and move, right? Whereas a plant can't get up and move, and they're way less tolerant to rapid temperature change. Animals are a little bit more tolerant to heat change, although not quite as much as we maybe would hope for. Another big problem that we're having, and you guys have probably all heard about the plight of our polar bears, is something called Arctic meltdown, or Arctic amplification. And it just means that the Arctic is warming way faster than the rest of the planet. So about twice as much as the rest of the planet. And the reason is because it used to be covered with sea ice, right? And sea ice reflects quite a bit of the heat. It's called something called the albedo effect. And all of that heat and sun that's being reflected off, now that that sea ice is melting, it's absorbing more and more, and it's just amplifying that heat more and more and more. And we've seen quite a decrease in sea ice, which is why our polar bears are having such a hard time, because that's their habitat. So we're losing lots of habitat for these polar bears, and they're no longer able to really live or survive any other places. So again, it affects a lot of different organisms, but these guys are starting to weigh about 55 pounds less than they did 30 years ago, which means that they're not quite as successful, and it really compromises their reproductive ability. So they're not reproducing as well or as much as they used to, which means that their populations overall are declining pretty rapidly. This is a pretty good video that you guys might want to watch. I can't show it on here, but it might help you sort of understand if animals are able to adapt to climate change. It's a really good video. I highly recommend looking it up. It's interesting nonetheless. It also might help you on your exam. Maybe it will show. I'll have you guys watch it on your own, though I'm not sure if you're seeing it. And last but not least, this is supercoral. So this is actually a little bit more related to Hawaii, because the researcher that's in this video also used to do research in Hawaii. But this is another interesting thing, whether corals can actually survive global warming and what supercorals actually are. So again, check this out. I don't think it's a very long video. You might see a question on the exam about supercorals. But that's all I have for you for ecosystems and climate change. Hopefully you guys got a lot out of it and understand exactly what climate is, as well as climate change and how it's affecting different ecosystems.